Thermaltake sent me this CTE T500 Air case. 1 second. As I was saying, Thermaltake sent me this CTE T500 Air to do a sponsored build, but the focus of the build is not this case. Instead, it is on these Swafan 12 and 14 fans. The idea is that you can interchange the rotors, so they come with 3 choices. The default is high air pressure for use on radiators or AIO coolers, but you can change out the rotor, so you can switch it from high pressure to regular airflow, or if you prefer, to reverse airflow. It's a very interesting concept, but before I can proceed with all this hardware, have you subscribed to KitGuru on YouTube? And if you have subscribed, have you rung the bell? This CTE T500 follows a similar form to the CTE C750 that I reviewed for KitGuru a few months ago. In fact, that was the world's first review of the C750. It's a tall case and you can have cooling in both the front and the back, but not so much in the roof. And the CTE part is consistent through the entire range, stands for Centralized Thermal Efficiency. Let's remove some panels and see what that means in practice. Hefty tempered glass main panel. We have this lower panel, and behind it there's nothing much to see at the moment. So in essence, this is a way for Thermaltake to have one of these hybrid side panels, both metal and glass, without having to bond the two together. At the front, clearly is designed for airflow. Behind that, we have a full-length filter. The right-hand side panel is designed for some airflow, but it's fundamentally plain steel. Bottom dust filter slides out to the side. Top panel, 2 thumb screws at the rear, and then it pops loose. And now you can see what I mean about not much scope for cooling in the roof. A single fan only. We can install a 360 or 420 in the front. We can install a 280 or 360 in the rear. Slides up and away. Again, fully filtered. And we can now see we have a smaller version of the C750 I mentioned previously. So we have a single fan at the rear, which is set in intake. Single fan at the front, also set in intake. Single fan in the roof, set in exhaust. And of course, with those Swafans, once they're installed, we'll be able to play around with the airflow. Front, back, up, down, intake, exhaust, we can do it however we see fit. This case is slightly cheaper than the C750. That's £160, this is £130. Thermaltake is confident the CTE T500 Air supports any type of cooling you might choose to install, including custom loop. However, we're going to make life nice and easy, and we're sticking with this 420mm Toughliquid AIO cooler from Thermaltake. The 3 fans installed in the CTE 500 are CT140s from Thermaltake. As I say, we have one in the front, one on the roof, one in the rear. And to install the 420mm AIO cooler in the front, I am of course going to have to move the fan from the front. And we have plenty of space there. However, if I choose, I can actually remove this entire section of the case, open out the front entirely. That does of course mean I'll lose the option of putting in a whole bunch of storage. We have drive sleds here. We also have some SSD mounts here, and if we look at the Thermaltake manual, we can see there are currently plenty of options for storage. Removing these bays is not the end of the world. So let's see what that looks like. Funnily enough, that leaves the drive cage in place, so let's remove that as a separate piece of hardware. I'm not sure it's necessary to open up the front of the case, but doing so gives us, I think, many more options. The next step is to install a motherboard assembly so we can see how the CTE T500 looks. Bearing in mind the motherboard is rotated 90 degrees, so the graphics card will be hanging close to the rear of the case. And then we can start figuring out things like power supply installation and what else we're going to do during this build. My chosen motherboard is this Gigabyte X670E Aorus Xtreme, which is AMD, AM5 and EATX in form factor. And to my mind it matches the CTE 500 admirably. The processor is an AMD Ryzen 9 7950X. I'm using a Sabrent Rocket 4 SSD. The memory is interesting. Very little of their RAM is non-RGBs. Here we have some ToughRAM RC DDR5 5600. Which also matches the aesthetic very nicely. Let's get the motherboard in the case. And remember, the rear I/O goes to the top. The motherboard is rotated 90 degrees. You have loads of access to the motherboard assembly inside the CTE 500. There is plenty of space. Now before I install this Toughpower GF A3 1050 watt power supply, ATX3 gold rated, I'm going to do something about this. I removed the drive cage assembly and there's a great big hole, but in the accessory pack Thermaltake includes this cover plate. Goes in place like that, and then you install the two thumb screws that were originally used for the drive cage. I have no doubt the power supply can slip in from the side, there's plenty of space there. But if we choose, we can remove the rear cover. And now there's all the space in the world. So let's open up the power supply and connect up the cables. The power supply is fully modular, just as we'd expect with an ATX3 unit that's fairly high end. And then we have the cables. European power cord, sadly, as I'm British and we use a different plug over here. All the cables are the licorice style apart from the 12 volt high power, so let's start with that. And then we'll find the 24 pin. I'm looking for the EPS connectors and I'm looking up in this corner. Of course, the board's rotated. We have two 8 pins. That's a 4+4. PCI Express, that looks like the, yep. Oh, the 8 is another 4+4. I'm not really sure what I need in the way of accessory power for the AIO cooler or any other bits and pieces I might be getting to, so let's just go mad and install far more than we require. So that's a load of SATA, more SATA, and some Molex. Power supply could indeed very easily go in from the side, no difficulty there, which means that this rear cover is slightly unnecessary. It's worth noting Thermaltake has put a sticker over the mains plug which warns you that there is a 0 fan switch just there. So if you turn your PC on and the fan doesn't spin into life, you can't hear anything, it's not broken, it's just set to not rotate. The next step is to install this Thermaltake Toughliquid Ultra 420 AIO cooler in the front of the case. However, I already have a fan in the front, so clearly I have to shift that first. Let's do something about that. Removing this front frame reveals the screws for the fan rack. And you can clearly see that these CT140 case fans have a very short cable where you can daisy chain them together if you choose, and then there's a lengthy extension cable. Because the case itself is fairly large and the cables need to reach, slightly messy setup, but it works well enough. I could install this fan below this other intake fan. That's probably the best thing to do. Alternatively, I could put it in the floor of the case. A slightly more unusual approach would be to install the fan blowing air directly at the motherboard tray. However, I don't feel the need to do that. I think I'll install this fan in this side. So we have 2 on this side, 3 on that, 1 in the roof. And it's the same deal with, I suppose we're going to have to say, the back of the case as with the front. So 4 screws and the bracket just lifts away. And then I can simply install the fan. With these fan racks removed and the motherboard assembly installed and the power supply in place, you've got all the access in the world if you fancy doing a custom loop installation. However, I'm going to keep it simple and stick to the AIO. Installing the Toughliquid Ultra 420 on this AM5 motherboard should be nice and straightforward. We'll leave the stock retention frame in place. Take the tiny tube of thermal compound, apply it like so, and then we install the pump body unit. The final piece of hardware is this Gigabyte RTX 4080 gaming OC, which is a substantial graphics card, and of course it hangs vertically in this case. And lock it down with 2 thumb screws in the traditional style. Attach the power cord. And once I've added a few more panels, we're ready for action. You can take it from me, now the system's fully built. It's rather hefty. I've got the 3 CT140s that come with the case locked to 1000 RPM and the 3 ToughRAM 14s on the AIO also locked to 1000 RPM. However, the CPU, this is the nature of Zen 4, is running at 95 Celsius under load. So as we go through Cinebench R23, the fans actually surge beyond 1000 up to 1200 RPM. In essence, the system is seeing that CPU temperature as problematic and is working to deal with it. Our Ryzen 9 is running at 95 degrees Celsius package temperature, and the RTX 4080 is just under 70 degrees on this very cool day here in the UK. A mere 17 degrees ambient. To help us visualize the airflow through the CTE T500 Air, let's introduce some smoke at the front, and we can see that it immediately goes straight out of the roof. And now it's time to remove these stock fans and replace them with these Swafan GT12 and GT14 units. On the AIO, I can install the fans in the default air pressure mode, and then I can switch over to airflow mode for fans in the back, the floor and the roof. I've installed 9 Swafan GTs in the CTE T500. We've got 3 140s in the front, 3 140s in the rear, 1 120 in the floor and 2 120s in the roof. It's interesting to note that this 140mm fan that came with the AIO cooler is not identical to the Swafan GT 140 with its high pressure default rotor installed. Although the fans have a lot of similarity, the fan blade design is clearly slightly different. The fans in the front and the rear are set to intake, the fans in the roof to exhaust, and the fan in the floor, despite appearances, is also set to intake, so it should be interesting to see how it performs. After I'd swapped out the fans, I reran my combination of time-spy stress test and Cinebench R23. Introducing some smoke, we can see the airflow is in at the back, out at the top, in at the front, out at the top. And truth be told, it didn't make a whole heap of difference. The ambient temperature had snuck up by 1 degree from 17 to 18. CPU temperature was unaffected. Again, that's the nature of Zen 4. It tends to sit at 95 degrees Celsius under load. The graphics temperature, however, dropped by 1 degree. Combining the increase in ambient and the decrease in graphics temp, that's a 2 degrees C win on the graphics temperature. But let's face it, that's a relatively minor victory. Okay, for the third and final run, I'm going to move around the rotors on these Swafan GTs, and this gives me something of a conundrum. The fans in the front are set to high pressure mode. They're up against a radiator, so it makes no sense to change that. The fans in the rear are set to intake, and they're against the graphics card. So switching those to reverse airflow means they'd be directly fighting against the graphics card. And that also makes very little sense to me. Pretty much my only option is to flip the exhaust fans in the roof to intake, and the intake fan in the floor, flip that, so that's in exhaust. So we're going to have one single exhaust fan going downwards rather than 2 fans going up. My prediction is that this will not work particularly well, but hey ho, let's give it a try. Switching out the rotors in the Swafan GTs is quick and simple. We flip the bottom fan to exhaust and we set the top fans to intake, and then we're ready for action. And using some smoke, we can see the airflow is absolutely hopeless. There's almost no sign of any exhaust through the floor of the case, and when we remove the glass side panel and take a closer look, it is entirely unclear what is going on. This didn't seem like a good idea to start with, and it's ended up as a poor idea. And to put some numbers on that temperature testing, the ambient here is still 18 degrees, the CPU crept up by 1 degree to 96, and the GPU crept up a few degrees to 73. So the original orientation for the fans was quite correct, and frankly the 3 stock case fans and the 3 fans on the Ultra 420, that worked perfectly well. So I've had some fun with these Swafan GT fans. I've installed many of them, I've moved them around slightly, and that brings us to the end of this showcase of the Thermaltake CTE T500 Air and these many fans. I hope you've learned a thing or two, and you can rest assured I am much the wiser myself.